Walls throughout Belfast, and see the cries of the lost as they turn to rend one another. Their impious prayer for Pope and Queen, for Prod, Papist, Loyalist and Fenian. The grate like a grotto halfway up the burnt-out gable. Or King William glorious as an archangel in triumph. These are our roadside shrines. Hell is the absence of possibilities. We salute icons rather than live in ideology. Relationships are ritualized, elaborate, understood. Whether it's the sectarian slanging between school children, or the club conversation in the golfer's bar where you're told religion's never mentioned in here, whether it's the ignorant vituperation from Paisleyite platforms, or the insulated and heroic boasting that has passed for politics. In all these cases, spectator and participant share a similar sense of déjà vu, have no illusions about the effect of their actions. There is no dynamic. The fixed postures and procedures of community division allow for little originality. The status quo, if you like, is not so much maintained by free will, it is predestined.
Seamus Heaney was born in 1939, about 40 miles north of Belfast in County Derry, in the townland of Tamniarn, within sight of the slopes of Slieve Gallen. His father and his father's people were cattle dealers and small farmers. Till now, the Heeneys have always lived off the land.
My God, the old man could handle a spade, just like his old man. My grandfather cut more turf in a day than any other man on Toner's bog. Once I carried him milk in a bottle, corked sloppily with paper. He straightened up to drink it, then fell to right away, nicking and slicing neatly, heaving sods over his shoulder, going down and down for the good turf, digging. The cold smell of potato mold, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge through living roots awaken in my head. But I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it.
But Seamus Heaney still returns to his roots for inspiration. Images remembered from his childhood in County Derry are turned to universal or very personal comment.
As a child, they couldn't keep me from wells and old pumps with buckets and windlasses. I loved the dark drop, the trapped sky, the smells of waterweed, fungus and dank moss. One in a brickyard with a rotted board top. I savored the rich crash when a bucket plummeted down at the end of a rope. So deep, you saw no reflection in it. A shallow one, under a dry stone ditch, fructified like any aquarium. When you dragged out long roots from the soft mulch, a white face hovered over the bottom. Now, to pry into roots, to finger slime, to stare, big-eyed Narcissus, into some spring is beneath all adult dignity. I rhyme to see myself, to set the darkness echoing.
But though he draws largely from the Ulster landscape, his view is not that of a fixed romantic, At times he seems to be almost dispassionate.
My father worked with a horse plough. His shoulders globed like a full sail strung between the shafts and the furrow. The horses strained at his clicking tongue. An expert, he would set the wing and fit the bright steel-pointed sock. The sod rolled over without breaking. I stumbled in his hobnailed wake, fell sometimes on the polished sod. Sometimes he rode me on his back, dipping and rising to his plod. I wanted to grow up and plough, to close one eye, stiffen my arm. All I ever did was follow in his broad shadow round the farm. I was a nuisance, tripping, falling, yapping always. But today, it is my father who keeps stumbling behind me and will not go away.
Change in himself, in the people he knew, and the traditions which surrounded him as a child, they are all important.
20 years ago, I herded cattle into pens or held them against a wall until my father won it arguing his own price on a crowd of cattlemen who handled rumps, groped teats, stood, paused, and then bought a round of drinks to clinch the bargain. Uncle and nephew, 50 years ago, heckled and herded through the fair days too. This barrel of a man penned in the frame. I see him with his jaunty hat pushed back, draw thumbs out of his waistcoat, curtly smack hands and sell. Father, I watched you do the same, and watched you sadden when the fairs were stopped. No room for dealers at the farmer's shop like housewives at an auction ring.
Long before Ulster became known for the violence in its streets, there was an awareness of violence in Seamus Heaney's work, the violence that is a normal part of farm life.
I was 6 when I first saw kittens drown. Dan Taggart pitched them, the scraggy wee shits, into a bucket. A frail metal sound, soft paws scraping like mad. But their tiny din was soon soused. They were slung on the snout of the pump and the water pumped in. Sure isn't it better for them now, Dan said. Like wet gloves they bobbed and shone till he sluiced them out on the dunghill, glossy and dead.
And the revulsion that he feels at the drowning of kittens recalls a deeper feeling of grief at the death of a young brother in a road accident.
Next morning, I went up into the room. Snowdrops and candles soothed the bedside. I saw him for the first time in 6 weeks. Paler now, wearing a poppy bruise on his left temple. He lay in the 4-foot box as in his cot. No gaudy scars. The bumper knocked him clear. A 4-foot box, a foot for every year.
Now Heaney has left County Derry. Today he's a lecturer in English at Queen's University, Belfast.
And, there's no other writer, apart from the ones I've mentioned, that anyone wants to do for Section C.
Is there any chance of further tutorial on McNeice?
Is any particular aspect of, is it the longer poems or shorter poems, or?
The longer.
Longer poems. Because I think we have we've dealt with a couple of the themes, haven't we? More or less childhood and Ireland and things like that. It might be worthwhile going back over them again, because it's been said so often that McNeice is really a lyric poet, a poet who's best in short sprints.
The circumstances of his life have changed, but the ties and traditions of childhood remain. For his Roman Catholic upbringing, there's still a feeling of respect.
The small wax candles melt to light, flicker in marble, reflect bright asterisks on brass candlesticks. At the Virgin's altar on the right, blue flames are jerking on wicks. Old dough-faced women with black shawls drawn down tight kneel in the stalls. Cold yellow candle tongues, blue flame, mince and caper as whispered calls take wing up to the holy name. Thus each day in the sacred place they kneel. Golden shrines, altar lace, marble columns and cool shadows still them. In the gloom, you cannot trace a wrinkle on their beeswax brows.
Like many another Irish writer, he doesn't lock himself away to meditate. He finds material in the streets of the city and the people he sees there.
There, in the corner, staring at his drink, the cap juts like a gantry's crossbeam, curling plated forehead and sledge-head jaw. Speech is clamped in the lips' vice. That fist would drop a hammer on a Catholic. Oh yes, that kind of thing could start again. The only Roman collar he tolerates smiles all round his sleek pint of porter. Mosaic imperatives bang home like rivets. God is a foreman with certain definite views who orders life in shifts of work and leisure. A factory horn will blare the resurrection. He sits strong and blunt as a Celtic cross, clearly used to silence and an armed chair. Tonight, the wife and children will be quiet at slammed door and smokers cough in the hall.
That kind of thing could start again, wrote Seamus Heaney in 1964. 5 years later, it did. In 1969, 13 people died as a result of rioting between Catholics and Protestants. 200 houses were totally destroyed, and many families left their homes as a result of threats to life and property. CS gas was used by both police and army. 6,500 troops are still helping to maintain law and order in the province. In Belfast, on the night of August the 15th, 7 people died. The journalist Max Hastings, in his book Ulster 1969, gives this eyewitness account of the scene the following day.
On Saturday, August the 16th, Belfast arose to find itself a war zone. Knife rests and concertina wire blocked off parts of the city. Troops checked vehicles moving in and out of the sensitive areas. Within their own ghettos, Catholics and Protestants worked to strengthen their barricades while the army patrolled between them, creating blockades of its own. Every plane into Belfast brought new contingents of reporters and cameramen from halfway across the world, as Ulster, to its bewilderment and fury, became the focal point of universal fascination.
Ulster may be of universal fascination to the journalist and the historian, to the uncommitted outsider, but what's it like to live in the place, to belong to it? Seamus Heaney lives with his wife and 2 children little more than a mile away from the scene of some of the worst rioting. The Ulster landscape has always been his inspiration. How does he feel about it now?
People often ask me, now that the violence and twistedness of this place have come to the fore again, people often ask me, would I never think of writing about it? And they mean, would I not think of describing events, or would I not think of enlisting myself in the cause of protest or in the cause of conciliation between the communities here. And in fact, I have written some journalism about what's happening. But the quick of the problem lies much deeper. Whatever's wrong in Northern Ireland, and whatever its origins and history, and whatever its symptoms, the ugliness of the extreme Protestantism, the deprivation in the ghettos, and the very real injustices that civil rights people have been working to redress, whatever's wrong behind all these things is more like a polluted atmosphere that people are breathing in, rather than an ugly townscape that they can change overnight. It shrivels people's trust and grows a shell on their generosity and makes them very alert for the mote in the eye of their brother. We're a society, if you like, that has fallen from grace. This is limbo land at best, and at worst, the country of the damned. And this, of course, is where we all grew up. It would be wrong to imply that anything like the viciousness and sectarianism and ignorant bigotry of the ghetto is the usual atmosphere in which the Ulster child grows up. Protestant and Catholic, Sinn Féiner and Orangeman can live together, farm together, drink together in the country still. There's usually a strong sense of community among small farmers anywhere, and here there are taboos and rituals built into the rhythms of life that make coexistence and lack of understanding quite possible. I remember demobbed orange men bringing my father rosary beads from Rome after the last war. I remember the Protestant children leaving our school at catechism time. Yet, even from the calm of that countryside, I can recapture menacing moments. In early July, the orange drums used to thunder for miles across the countryside in the late evening.
The lamb beg balloons at his belly, weighs him back on his haunches, lodging thunder grossly there between his chin and his knees. He is raised up by what he buckles under. Each arm extended by a seasoned rod, he parades behind it. And though the drummers are granted passage through the nodding crowd, it is the drums preside like giant tumors. Training the note of hate on the ear's greed, his battered signature subscribes no pope. The pigskins scourged until his knuckles bleed. The air is pounding like a stethoscope.
And then, on a Saturday evening in the local market town, you might see your neighbors dressed in black uniforms with guns slung on their backs, suddenly distant under the peak of their caps and the grip of their belts. They had become the B Specials, the Protestant militia on their way to shooting practice. It was all part of the routine, but in retrospect, it's all part of our problem. Recently, the force was disbanded with full honours by the Northern Ireland Prime Minister.
And will continue to do it, I know, up to the moment when the force stands down. Ulster owes you an immense...
That is a shooting range. In the cool of the evening, the couched herds are well used to reports and short volleys that die barking on the slopes. Do they recognize these characters, peaked, buckled, and hitched to traditions, unstacking the poles of a style, or so expertly unbushing and bushing the gaps? Their boots, spattered with raindrops, rigid and sparbled, are ripping the grass in their wedges. Their hands on barrel and butt are polished as these. Lately, when pigs squealed under the 16-pound hammer and gully, when the lame horse was destroyed in the yard and the carcass winched away, these troopers were just warming up Look at the palings they sharpened and drove, and the stretch they can put on barbed wire. Target practice is child's play to these boys.
This impasse is reflected in all kinds of ways. In the humorous stories of the Pope and Paisley, or what the Presbyterian minister said to the Catholic priest about the size of the whiskey glass. Those gilded jokes that pass for community relations among the professional classes. Northern Ireland was ripe for blacker comedy long ago, but nothing has been forthcoming. Much successful local comedy, on and off the stage, plays on the orange and green subcultures, but in such a way as to confirm rather than challenge them. And worse than this is the tendency by the more articulate citizens to ignore these realities altogether. In such a situation, the writer's role might be expected to be a destructive one. Certainly, his work should not be pandering to the prejudices or procedures of the community as it works now. For of all people, the writer might be expected to be the first to swim free from the undertow of his pieties and traditions. Yet, the paradoxical thing about much Irish writing is the strength of its umbilical links, the strong pull of its pieties, its backward look into its origins. The denial of life here should be translated into the writer's disappointment. People must see that their household gods, their Larrys, can grow into furies.
Our Lars, always at stud, battering out a spore of fouled whitewash and tar, now haunts the charred gables, poison curd on the walls, abandoned urinals. Here in the tundra, we trot among our icons. Old dung scattered like brains, hardening underfoot. We gather and burn it, wreaking our lives. Purses shriveled like figs, cast-offs, spent cartridges. God, we will defend these scraps with nails and canines, our bonded detritus. Pieties, rare droppings.
I remember as a child being lost for a whole afternoon. It must have been the summertime, where I was hidden in the middle of a pea rig in the field below the house. I was crouched among the green stalks and young pods, hedged about by the rods and tendrils. And I just sat there in secrecy, hearing my mother calling from the yard. And I sometimes think that the first poems I wrote were an attempt to re-enter that fetal position. A repossession of the secret corners of my life. And if I were to seek an image of my present state of mind, I might recall standing at the end of our lane one evening and looking out towards Slieve Gallen. It was Christmas Eve, and I think my father had told us that if we were very good and very quiet, we could hear Santa Claus coming over the mountain. We could hear the bells of his sleigh as he came over Slieve Gallen. So there I was, standing at the end of the lane, not really believing in Santa Claus, yet not wanting to admit to myself that I didn't believe in him. Halfway towards shedding the illusions of childhood, you might say, and half refusing the responsibility of growing up. And that's more or less the way people feel here nowadays. They're living in a kind of shell, a kind of hiatus or limbo. They feel their old secure mythologies are crumbling away from them, and yet they refuse the responsibility and the strain and the pain of changing their way of thinking and feeling and living. But I suppose people themselves must change. They must crawl out of the bog of their history